אז נמצא איתנו כאן האנליסט הבכיר דיוויד שהתראיין אצלנו בפודקאסט לפני מספר שבועות. דיוויד גם מחזיק פודקאסט משלו באתר מידע, שבו הוא מנתח את המגמות בשוק ואת המגמות הגיאו-אסטרטגיות העולמיות. ודיוויד בשיחה שהייתה לנו בפעם הקודמת נתן בעצם סוג של פרשנות או איזושהי תחזית לגבי מה שקורה בעולם, מה שקורה במזרח התיכון בהקשרי רוסיה ואיראן. הייתה לו איזושהי הבחנה שייתכן שהניסיון של טראמפ להגיע לפשרה ולהסכם עם פוטין באוקראינה נועד בעצם לייצר את התנאים לפעולה צבאית כנראה באיראן, לתקיפה באיראן, ודייוויד ביקש שאנחנו נשוחח שוב על הנושאים האלה כי דברים קצת השתנו מבחינת הזירה העולמית. אני עכשיו עובר לשפה האנגלית, זאת השפה שבה התקיים הרעיון, אפשר למצוא כתוביות כמובן ביוטיוב. So David, I'm happy to have you on our show again. And actually, we need to talk because a lot of things changed from our previous conversation. Mostly the Trump-Putin settlement on Ukraine seems like it's not really happening. And you have a lot to say about that, so I'll be glad to hear your thoughts.
I think, I think I might have mentioned, I think I did mention it, I think in our last conversation, that I thought that the ceasefire right now has little chance of succeeding, okay? Because the reason is because I think, anybody who follows this war closely will tell you that there is no way that Putin is going to end the war without gaining control of what remains of the Donetsk Oblast that is not yet under Russian control. Now, in other words, we're talking about several very important strategic towns that include Kupiansk, Liman, Seversk, Pokrovsk. And these towns are not just important towns, because they're big, but also because, without gaining control of these towns, the Russian defense line will be not sustainable in the future. So from that point of view, forget about the fact that Putin had announced annexation of all these oblasts and that he only so far has 70% control of Donetsk. But I think, it's very unlikely that Putin is going to agree to a ceasefire during which that Zelensky and Ukraine could potentially rearm without Russia first gaining control of those towns. And I think from that point of view, I thought that it was a bit of a mistake for Trump to reach out to Putin as early as he did in trying to mediate a ceasefire when the Russians clearly were not ready to basically, to agree to a ceasefire. And of course, that's what we found out last week. To the extent that, the sort of the negotiation, essentially ran out of juice, ran out of steam. Right? That's when we heard from the Russian deputy foreign minister during an interview that basically that the American ceasefire proposal does not address the fundamental concern of the Russians in terms of the need to basically deal with the root cause of the conflict. Okay. And I think that was a very, very clear, as clear as it can be in diplomatic speak, that the ceasefire negotiation has hit a wall. Okay. Now, I think, unfortunately, the problem, again, is that Trump had promised that he was going to end the war quickly. And in that respect, he had already committed a lot of political capital to see it through, right? If you remember the whole appeasement of Putin, okay, trying to basically bring Putin to the table, including selling Ukraine down the toilet, all that, sort of like, had to be swallowed by the so-called Russia hawks in Washington. And now that Putin has basically rejected Trump's overture, the Russia hawks are making a big comeback. And in this respect, the Senate is already literally about to introduce a bill to impose additional sanctions on Russia. And by the way, if they should pass the bill, Trump will almost have no choice but to sign it. And if he signs it, this will definitely bind his hands in terms of dealing with Russia. But you might say, well, what does Israel care about this? The reason why I, as someone who lived in Israel, and any Israeli should care, is because this has huge, massive consequences for Israel. Okay. The reason is because, and I explained to you, in our last conversation, the main reason why Trump has been so quick to sell Ukraine down the toilet, it was because he was trying to convince Putin to turn a blind eye when Trump goes after Iran. Okay. That Trump decided, you know what, to Putin, you can have Ukraine, but give me Iran. Okay. So the fact that now all of a sudden, the Ukraine track has blown up, or rather it's hit a wall, we should basically assume at this point that there is no deal about Iran. That is the reason why in the same interview, okay, with the Russian deputy foreign minister, later on in the interview, he said that if the US were to hit Iran's nuclear weapons program, this will be met by, he said, catastrophic consequences. Now, catastrophic consequences, again, is diplomatic speak for, you know what? If you hit Iran, then we may have no choice but to get involved directly in the conflict. And this is hugely, hugely important. Okay. Because what this basically says is that, wow, so Russia, if Trump were to hit Iran, Trump might have to run the risk of drawing Russia directly into the conflict, which might make Trump think twice. Now, I don't think it was a coincidence that less than 24 hours after this interview with the Russian deputy foreign minister, the senior advisor to Khamenei warned that if the US were to hit Iran's nuclear weapons program, this would force Iran to basically acquire a nuclear weapons program. Okay. Now, if you put the one and one together, now the consideration that Trump will have to take into account when he decides to give whatever, decide to go after Iran, is that let's just say they decide to go after Iran's nuclear program. If it should fail, let's just basically define failure in a very explicit way. Let's just assume failure is that somehow the attack still leaves Iranian nuclear program more or less intact to the extent it fails to destroy the entire stock of uranium enrichment. The decision that Bibi and basically Trump will have to make now is that if you're going to go hit Iran and you fail, then this will give Iran, Russia, and China a perfect excuse to help Iran to cross the nuclear threshold.
So basically what you're saying is that the Trump strategy so far was to try to dissolve this new axis and take Russia out of this package with a Ukraine deal. This failed, and therefore the axis actually got more close. And now actually the situation is even more dangerous. Now we see in the region a lot of force buildup. There's a lot of a lot of preparations for something that seems they can attack on Iran. Just today or yesterday, more THAAD missiles landed in Israel, and we hear Israel's defense minister talking about Iran's involvement in funding the October 7th attacks. There's all of these, things happening that seem like a buildup towards this attack, and then you think, so what's going to be tomorrow with the Netanyahu-Trump discussion? This is on the table. That's what you think.
Because another complicating factor here, which is very important that happened last week, of course, as by now everybody knows, that Trump basically unleashed, the trade war of all trade wars. Okay. And, I just put out a video. If you're interested, check it out, your viewers, my YouTube channel, in which I argue that actually, if you look at the so-called global trade war that Trump just unleashed, okay, it is very clear to me that the real target of this global trade war is China. You know what? Forget about the fact, so Israel got hit by 17% tariff. It's like nothing. Okay. China had just been hit with a tariff of 54%. This is on top of the 20% tariff that Trump had imposed on China in his first term. Now, let me tell you this, 54% tariff, okay, is a death sentence, by the way. Because in my humble opinion, okay, you have to realize that Chinese exporters have an average margin, gross margin around 5%. At 54%, okay, this means that, Chinese exporters, there's no way they can actually make money exporting to the US. In other words, that export to the US will go to zero. Okay. And in my humble opinion, that may very well be the aim of the architect of this entire trade war, which is to deal a blow, economic blow to China so hard that they cannot recover, by the way. Because you have to understand, export is about 20% of Chinese GDP. My calculation shows that direct, indirect export to the US is about 25% of total Chinese exports. So you're talking about 5% of GDP is export to the US. And given the industrial production is about 40% of GDP, so export to the US is about like 10% of total Chinese industrial production. Now, that's just basically like the direct impact. Now, we start to basically think about the secondary impact on the Chinese economy from this tariff war. It's even more dramatic because, China invests more than any country on the face of the planet. 40% of Chinese GDP is investment in fixed assets. Okay. Now, China is already sitting on massive spare capacity in so many different areas. Okay. And guess what? This tariff is going to reduce profitability of Chinese businesses, make it even less attractive to invest. And then you're probably going to see a spike in non-performing loans, all of which is going to be a big drag on Chinese investment. Okay. And if we see a slowdown in Chinese investment, then the economy literally is going to basically fall to its knees. Okay. Now, I have no doubt, like the architects of Trump's trade war are very well aware of what they're doing. And I think what is really going on, just like I just told you before, the Russia hawks in Washington are basically literally getting ready to basically hit back at Russia and Putin hard. In my humble opinion, Trump's latest trade war is basically very strong evidence that the China hawks are taking over in Washington again. This is why, in my humble opinion, this is the reason why we heard a lot of, speculation last week that Elon Musk, who's a famous China dove, is maybe on his way out. Okay. Now, what I'm telling you is, why am I telling you all this? Because I think, again, my view is that this whole entire trade war is designed to basically essentially destroy the Chinese economy. And you could argue from the US standpoint, after the whole DeepSeek news, the need to destroy China has never been more urgent as now. Okay? That China is basically, like only a week ago, we had the news that BYD has now just launched a new supercharger that is twice as fast as the supercharger of Tesla that can basically fill up your car, okay, in just 5 minutes. So basically, the US is scrambling for a response. And in my humble opinion, I think that they've gone down this path in the hope that this will buy them time in terms of basically keeping China at bay, okay, to hold China off. But the point here is this. This is the most interesting thing. You might say, well, David, based on what you're speculating this and this and that. Let me just tell you this. Friday morning, we saw a massive retaliation from the Chinese. Okay, they hit US imports with a 34% tariff. And what was most interesting, so Friday morning, they hit US, okay, with a 35% tariff. Now, let me tell you this. Over the last 4 years, Biden has been hitting China again and again with sanctions. The Chinese never reacted. The fact that on this occasion they reacted, to me, it just means one thing, which is whether I'm right or not. Beijing clearly agrees with my analysis, and they probably share my fear that this is exactly what the Americans are doing. Now, imagine now the Chinese now believe that the U.S. has declared war on China. Okay, what do you think China is going to do with Iran? No, you
So basically, yeah, we're getting close to our time limit also. But basically, if in a previous conversation you were talking about maybe dissolving tensions, and now it seems like tensions are actually building up with the failure of the Russia agreement, and then Trump decides to go to push, with full gas on tensions, including maybe a military attack in Iran and a trade war with China. So he's pushing to there. I mean, that's what it seems like.
Because I also told you last time, I said that the biggest danger, okay, to Trump 2.0 is the military industrial complex. The warmongers in Washington that want to keep these forever wars going for as long as they can. Okay. Since we last spoke, both houses of Congress have just basically approved an additional $100 billion additional defense spending at a time that they're trying to cut everything back. Okay. What I'm telling you is that these people, and most of them are Jewish, and I told you this last time too, okay, who are affiliated, the so-called neocons, okay, in Washington, that's it. They see, again, they see the world in terms of democracy versus authoritarian regime. They want to basically, be done with Russia and China once for all. And Trump came in and wanted to do something very different. But I always thought that they're not going to give up. And then if Trump were to make a mistake, they were going to come all the way. And this is where we are now. So basically, all of a sudden, I thought it was going to be a walk in the park for Israel to go in there and hit Iran. Now, all of a sudden, this is why it gets very interesting. I wonder what Bibi is going to tell Trump tomorrow. I don't know what he's going to tell him, but obviously I think Bibi is going to tell Trump, we can't wait on this, because Trump right now, the stock market is in a free fall. The U.S. is about to hit a recession. Probably Trump would like to basically, wait on Iran for another month before he does anything. But what if I were to tell you that Bibi is going to say, well, by the way, according to our latest intelligence, Mossad intelligence, that, 2 Russian scientists and 1 Chinese scientist just arrived in Tehran. What are you going to do with that information if that's happening? Because there is no question, there's no question in my mind, okay, with everything that's happened in the last week, okay, the Chinese and the Russians might decide that it's time for them to help Iran to cross the nuclear threshold before basically the deadline of Trump's 2-month, whatever it is, ultimatum.
Right.
Can Israel?
So time is playing against us now. So it's maybe in essence to act fast. That's what you're basically saying.
Exactly. But what I'm also telling you, that this is going to be a difficult conversation, because Bibi said, well, you know what? You don't have to get involved. We're going to go and do it. Okay? But listen, Bibi had better basically know that it's going to be like 100% success. Because I said before, if they go out there and hit Iran, and they do not successfully destroy Iran's nuclear program, then for sure, Iran is going to become a nuclear power very soon with the assistance of Russians and Chinese. And that is something this is why Bibi is facing possibly the most difficult decision, I think, confronting any Israeli leader since the founding of Israel. And this is why, but then again, I think we have a very brilliant prime minister, and I hope that he'll make the right decision based on the intelligence that he has. But I just hope that he's got good intelligence, that if they're going to go after Iran, they can actually destroy it, because failure is not an option.
So I'd like to conclude with, maybe we can just hope that this Passover will be another redemption of Israel from one of its enemies, and that hopefully brings will work out well, and then this will go down in history as like maybe a second Exodus, hopefully. And thank you so much for coming on again, and I'll be glad to speak to you again in the future once we know what's going on. It's always interesting to listen to you, and obviously following your podcast and your analysis. So thank you so much, David, and have a happy Passover.
Thank you very much. Okay. Take care, Akiva. Okay.
Bye-bye. Bye.